What we're going to talk about are the 5 reasons that you should or should not buy real estate. Now understand that when you buy real estate, there's not one definitive reason that makes you want to buy or not buy based on your goals and based on your strategies. So no matter what you can think about or what you hear, it's always going to boil down to 5 reasons that make sense. And this is like a puzzle. You're putting all the pieces together, and the ones that make more sense or the ones that make more deciding of a factor for you are based on what is more important for you based on your goals, based on your strategies, and again, based on your tactics. So the first reason that you may or may not buy a property is what's called cash flow. Cash flow, very simply, is the difference between what you rent a property for and what your debt servicing is. So your mortgage, your taxes, your insurance. The difference between the two is what's called cash flow. Now, many people that I talk to will tell me that they will or will not buy a property based specifically on cash flow. That tells me that they're not looking at all the other pieces of the puzzle, and there's a bigger picture that maybe they're not understanding. Many newer people always focus purely on cash flow, but not all investors do, and I'm going to explain why. The second thing is what's called equity capture. What equity capture is when you buy a property, let's say a property is worth $150,000, but you buy it for $120,000 because somebody needed to sell. They were motivated, right? But the house is worth $150,000, but they needed to sell it quickly. The difference between what it's worth and what you buy it for is what's called equity capture. You are going to sign a piece of paper, and once you sign that piece of paper, you will have made $30,000 in this case of what's called unrealized capital gain. Now, it does not go into your pocket because it's in the equity of the property, but the equity is there at time of purchase. Now, there's not many other investment strategies that I know of that you can do where you sign a piece of paper and you can make that money just because someone else needs to get out of what they own. So equity capture, while it may not be the only reason, it's part of a bigger picture. Now, the next thing you're going to look at is what's called debt paydown. Debt paydown is a tenant in your property paying the mortgage, which is part of their rent, down to zero, essentially. So if your strategy is to hold this property for 30 years, and you have a 30-year mortgage, essentially you will have a tenant paying down that mortgage to zero. Now, I understand you're going to have vacancies, you're going to have costs associated with the property, maintenance and other things, but essentially a tenant will be paying that mortgage down to zero for you, and you will still own that asset. Now, the next reason is what's called depreciation. Depreciation is something that the IRS allows investors to depreciate the property over a certain amount of time. Standard depreciation is roughly 27.5 years. They say that after 27.5 years, this property will be worth nothing from a tax standpoint. So what's important to know about this is if you have a W-2 job or you are doing any expenses to your property, that is something that gets depreciated off of your earnings. Depreciation, again, is not a reason why you should or should not buy a piece of property, but it's a piece of the puzzle. Now, the last piece that most people do not think about is what's called appreciation. Appreciation is what the property will be worth as time goes on. So if you were to think that you're going to hold this property for 30 years, think about 30 years back. If you were to have purchased a property in any town USA, what would that house be worth today? Now think about this. You're going to be getting cash flow. You're going to capture some equity, chances are. If a tenant is in the property, you're going to get debt pay down. You will be able to depreciate the property, and the property will go up in value. You need to decide which one of these are most important. Now, when you purchase a property, you are probably always going to get depreciation. That is going to happen on its own because that is something that is afforded by the tax code. Also, a tenant is going to pay down the debt for you if you have a tenant in your property. So these two are going to happen regardless. So you have to ask yourself, what is more important, cash flow, equity capture, or appreciation? This is when it comes into your goals. If you need the money to live off of on a daily basis, then maybe cash flow is most important to you. But if you're like most people and you're buying an investment property for down the road, 30 years when you retire, appreciation should be the most important. So when you're looking at a deal, this is when you start asking, what is the most important and how is this a good deal for me? Well, a good deal for me may be appreciation because I have a job. Equity capture would be nice, but I don't necessarily need the cash flow. I want to make sure that this is going to go up in value most. One thing you want to know is that statistically, on the East Coast and West Coast of the United States, properties will double in value every 7 to 9 years. Now, it's not a straight line appreciation because, as I said, the structure is depreciated. Now, when the property goes up in value and you have it for 30 years, it is going to keep going and going and going. Now, in the Midwest of the United States, it's every 12 to 15 years. So let's just do some math and say that you bought a property that was worth $150,000, so it was worth $150,000, and you got it for $120,000. The difference of that is going to be $30,000 of equity capture. Not an amazingly great deal, but it's not a bad deal. This may not be the reason that you buy the property, but again, it's part of the puzzle. Now, let's say this property only gave you $100 a month in cash flow. Well, if you need the cash flow, you may say, based on this information, this is not a good deal. Now, if we go a little bit further and say this property is in the Midwest of the United States, and I'm going to hold this for 30 years. So in 15 years, it'll go from 150 to 300. And then what's going to happen is another 15 years, it will now go to 600. Okay? The biggest mistake people make is that they buy a property today based on the cash flow and what it's worth for something that's going to be the future. So now, if you were to think, if you owned a property in 30 years when you retire, and you have an asset worth $600,000 that a tenant paid off to zero, and you were able to get the tax depreciation on it, at $600,000 property is not going to be renting for the same amount it would rent for if it was at 150. It's going to go up as the property goes up. So normally they talk about a 1% rule. 1% rule is that the property will be worth $150,000 and it may rent for $1,500. Now, as the property goes up in value to $200,000, the rent's going to go up. $300, $400, $500. Every time you do that, the rent's going to be going up. And now you have an asset worth $600,000 that you owe no money on, and you're getting the cash flow. And the only debt servicing you have is taxes and insurance. So again, just remember that when you're looking at a deal, this is a formula and a recipe based on your goals and based on your strategy. So think of cash flow, equity capture, debt pay down, depreciation, and appreciation. And understand that there's not a right or a wrong way. It's just whatever is the best way to fit your strategy. And think of which one of these, which one is the non-negotiable that you must have when you're looking at a deal. And that is your focus. Hopefully this helped you. Again, I'm Steve Rosenberg. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.